All right, folks, so let's take a little bit of time here to talk about the presidential election process, otherwise known as the presidential campaign. So last year, we had over 25 Democrats that were trying to become their party's nominee to run for president. And then there was a process of winnowing down these candidates down to one, Joe Biden. He ended up being the Democratic candidate for president. So we have to go all the way back to what we call the invisible primary. This is a period of time before the candidates even declare their candidacy. They're really just testing the waters. They're hinting at the possibility that they might run for president. They're floating their name out there and seeing if they're gaining traction with donors, with the base, with the media. They might form an exploratory committee, which allows them to raise money. So this is an important period of time. Back in 2012, Mitt Romney, so even before he declared his candidacy for president, he raised $90 million during the invisible primary. He was able to build an organization and establish credibility, the legitimacy of his candidacy. Yeah. Now, step two, we call the primary and caucus season. So every state, every territory is going to hold what we either call a primary or a caucus. And the candidates are going to go around and participate in these. They're going to try to campaign in almost every state, every territory. Okay. Now, at this point, they have declared their candidacy. And since 1968, we've really seen that the choosing of the party's candidate has become more democratic. Now, prior to 1968, there were still national conventions where the candidate was nominated and chosen. But prior to 1968, that was really controlled by the party elite. And we'll talk more about that, how the process has become more democratic, how we, the people, the party and the electorate, have more voice in who the candidate of each party is going to be. So today, Iowa traditionally goes first and then New Hampshire second. You might note that they don't look demographically like the United States. So South Carolina and Nevada are the third and fourth states. They kind of look a little bit more like the United States demographically. But tradition has Iowa and New Hampshire go first. And they have an inordinate amount of say on who ends up being the party's nominee. Some states have caucuses, some states have primaries. We'll talk more about that in the next slide here. The goal, so when we get down here, you'll note that some people drop out even before Iowa holds its caucus. So Bill de Blasio is the mayor of New York City. And why did he drop out? Probably because he was polling at 0.4 of a percentage point. Same with Kristen Gillibrand. She's a senator from New York, and she was polling at 0.6 of a percentage point. So when they've realized that they're not going to have traction in Iowa, a lot of candidates start dropping out there. The goal in the primary and caucus season is to appeal to the base. We've already know that someone with a more extreme ideology is more likely to always vote. That means that they're more likely to participate in primary elections and in caucuses. Okay? So, and then that term that you will often hear as a result or as in reference to this part of the presidential campaign is front loading. So the states themselves get to decide when to have their primaries, when to have their caucuses. And they're always trying to leapfrog each other and get closer to the beginning so that their state has more of an impact on who the party's candidate ultimately is. Okay, now primaries. What you need to know about primaries is that they are elections run by the state governments. You show up, you vote, you get your sticker, you go home. It doesn't take that much time. We have three types of primaries. An open primary means that anybody can show up and participate in the primary. When you do show up at the poll, you either get the Democratic ballot or you get the Republican ballot, and you get to show your preference for which Democrat, which Republican you want to be your party's nominee for president or for other offices as well. Closed primaries are a little more elitist in that you actually have to prove you are a member of that party. Okay, so you think of it like this. Those people that participate in the closed primaries are probably your party activists. Those people that participate in open primaries are your party in the electorate. Okay, and blanket primaries are a little bit of an oddball, and not too many states have these, just very few. I'm not even sure if any states still have blanket primaries, but you'd show up, you get a single ballot, but on that ballot, you'd get the option to either participate in the Democrat or Republican primary. So as you go down the ballot for different offices, you can pick and choose which party's candidates, slate of candidates, you want to narrow down. All right. The Just know the caucuses, Minnesota switched from a caucus system to a presidential system this past time around. Primaries themselves are seen as being more democratic because they're open to more people. Your moderately liberal, your moderately conservatives are likely to participate in a primary. Whereas in a caucus, this involves more of a time commitment because it's an actual meeting. It can take several hours. So usually a caucus, those people that go there are your consistently conservatives, your consistently liberal people. Okay, so your party base is more likely to participate in a caucus because it's longer. You talk about the issues, you make policy proposals for the platform, and then finally you get around to what's called a presidential preference poll, where you indicate which candidate you prefer to be your party's nominee for president. There's only 6 states that still have caucuses. Now, just what I want you to know about this map, I know it's from 2016, a little bit old, but you should note that the territories are listed. So the territories participate in primaries and caucuses in choosing the party's nominee. Okay? So Puerto Rico might have a primary, and you can decide who you want to be the Republican candidate for president. Now, if you're a resident of Puerto Rico, you do not get to participate in the general election. So once we decide who the nominees are going to be, when this passed around, it was Donald Trump and Joe Biden. If you're a resident of Puerto Rico, you don't get to vote in the general election. You can vote in the primary election. Okay. You might also note, so one thing the map shows us here is this is a reflection of federalism. It's the states that decide when the primaries and caucuses are going to be. You will also note that some of those states are striped, okay, which indicates that, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party don't necessarily hold their primary or their caucus on the same date. Okay, so in some ways, the parties themselves make the rules around when these events happen and how they happen. You should also note that, now we're going on to the next slide here. Step 3, amass delegates. So what happens here is based on your performance in a primary or a caucus, you pick up delegates who are actual people who are then pledged to vote for you at the national convention. Okay. Some states award their delegates proportionally. So if I win 60% of the vote in Nevada, I get 60% of Nevada's delegates. Other states award them on a winner-take-all basis. So if I win North Dakota, I win all of North Dakota's delegates. You will also note that in 2020, if I was a Democratic candidate, I needed the support of 1,990 delegates at the national convention. I needed those votes to become the party's nominee, which is a majority of the delegates that attended the national convention. However, if I was a Republican candidate, I only needed the support of 1,276 delegates. That was a majority of the Republican delegates. So once again, it's the party themselves that make a lot of rules about how this system happens. Democrats also have what we call superdelegates, which is so you'd say that is actually a reflection of the elite theory of democracy, or maybe of a belief in meritocracy. So a superdelegate is a high-ranking Democrat, or a Democrat that actually has served in office, and they get to vote on who the party's nominee as well. They're not chosen by the people. So in that case, the more influence we give the superdelegates, the less influence the people have in choosing who the nominee is going to be. Now, the Democrats have been moving away from that system because they didn't want it to be viewed that the superdelegates were choosing the nominee. So since 1968, this process of selecting the candidate has become more democratic. And the selection of the candidate is based more on the wishes of the party in the electorate and less on the wishes of the party in government or the elites. We get to the national convention. It's a big kind of orchestrated affair. That's where the candidate is officially nominated. That's where the delegates vote. Again, you need the support of a majority of the delegates to become the party's nominee. We usually know that in advance. We know who has achieved the threshold of a majority of the delegates for each party before they even vote. The party platform is finalized, and the vice president is announced or selected at the national convention. There's speeches given, there's baby kissing, there's balloon drops. Each party is trying to best appeal to voters. They're already making that shift to appeal to for the general election. You should note that the party out of power, the party that does not control the presidency, holds their national convention first. The party in power, the party that controls the presidency, gets to go second. So they get to respond to what was happening in the first national convention. So it's always an advantage to go second. Now, 2020 was a completely different year because of COVID, because of the pandemic. The national conventions were held in a completely different manner. Now, the other thing we want to point out is 1976. So what happened in 1968 is there were riots at the Democratic National Convention, because even though there were primaries and there were caucuses, the party and the electorate participated in the selection of delegates who then voted and gave their preference at the National Convention. The rules themselves said that the party didn't actually have to listen to that. So behind closed doors, what ended up happening is 68, they nominated somebody that had been involved in the ongoing war effort in Vietnam, and your party in the electorate was not happy about that. It was Hubert H. Humphrey. So Hubert H. Humphrey had actually won all the caucuses, but he did not win a single primary, if I remember correctly. And there were riots as a result when it came to be known that they were kind of moving away from the wishes of the party and electorate and selected this party elite to be their candidate. So when 1976 rolls around, the Democratic Party makes a full-on shift of like, all right, we're going to listen. We're going to let the party in the electorate. We're going to let the delegates themselves choose who the candidate's going to be. And that's when they nominated Jimmy Carter, who was viewed as a complete outsider. Okay? The general election. So even before the national convention, once we know who's locked up the nomination, who has a majority of the delegate support, they're going to turn their focus on the general election and start campaigning against the other party's nominee. Okay. Now we know that in the general election, the key is to win the swing states. You want to win over the swing voters in the swing states. So a swing state is just a state that's made up of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, but there's going to be a small amount of independents that we call swing voters, and you want to win them. This is where the vast majority of money is spent, is in the general election. This is where we have our presidential debates. The debates themselves are rarely game changers. The most famous debate was 1960, JFK versus Nixon. It was the first televised debate, and a lot of people credit JFK with winning that debate because Nixon himself didn't realize the very visual aspect of being on TV, and he had a 5 o'clock shadow. He forgot to shave, whereas JFK came looking very presidential and very young, and he had a good TV persona. And now, in 2020, the first debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, you might consider to be a game changer as well because of the fact that it wasn't very much like a debate. Kind of turned off a lot of people. And what impact that has actually had on the election, well, that still needs to be analyzed. We'll find out maybe a few years down the road. During this period of time, you also want to watch out for gaffes or just mistakes people make. Romney, there's a link there, and I'll put this presentation on. Just the presentation itself will be available on Schoology, so you can follow those links. Romney it was being secretly recorded at a meeting where he was talking about how there were certain people that just would always vote Democrat. I forget the comment he actually made, but you can watch the video yourself. And then Clinton, of course, classically, when she was running against Trump, talked about Trump voters as being deplorables. And that, of course, came back to haunt her a little bit there. Now, also during this part of the campaign, the general election campaign, is when we need to understand these types of issues here. So valence issues are those issues where the two parties agree. So they agree on the actual solution to the issue. Foreign policy was always considered a valence issue. It didn't matter who was in the White House, Republican or Democrat. If you were, from the viewpoint of from France or from Germany, you knew that the foreign policy was going to be conducted very much the same from both parties. Now, that's not the case anymore. Position issues are those issues where the parties differ, where they have differing solutions. And wedge issues are those issues that actually divide a party, where the one party itself has competing solutions. So Joe Biden's strategy, you could say, was to talk a lot about valence issues. He talked a lot about COVID because the majority of the country kind of said, oh, well, this is the solution. This is the direction we need to take concerning the pandemic. You might also consider that a wedge issue because it might have divided Republicans themselves on what was the best approach to dealing with the pandemic. Now, Donald Trump, he liked to talk about position issues like the economy, specifically how best to recover the economy from the pandemic. And he positioned himself to be the candidate that was best able to address that issue, talking about position issues. The Electoral College, there's another screencast about that. You know what that is. The electorates gather in their respective state capitals in mid-December, and they vote. They cast one vote for president, one vote for vice president, and you need 270 votes to win, to become president of the United States. All right, so this is the last slide here. Let's start with the inauguration. So the peaceful transfer of power is something you've been hearing about a lot in the news. And that's going to take place on January 20th, where the new president is inaugurated and the old president leaves office. And so now every president's going to claim that they have an electoral mandate, which is basically the voters, the public have endorsed that candidate's, the winner of the elections, platform and sort of in positions on issues and say, we want you to move forward with those and make those the law of the land. Okay, now some mandates are definitely stronger than others. Ronald Reagan in '84 definitely had a mandate when you look at how many electoral votes he won, how many states he won. Whether Joe Biden has a mandate with 306 electoral votes, if that remains the number, is questionable, but he did win. In combination with the mandate, a candidate's going to come in with a certain amount of political capital. And you think of that as money, but really what it is trust, goodwill, and influence that the winning candidate has because of the public support, and they can spend that on getting their agenda through Congress. So political capital is often spent in this period of time that we call the honeymoon period, which is the first 100 days of any presidency. It's when the president's less prone to criticism and less prone to scrutiny, where people are generally willing to take an honest approach and listen to the desires of the new administration and have an honest debate about it. But if you don't get that agenda through the first 100 days, that honeymoon period doesn't last very long. All right, so that's basically it. That's the presidential campaign in a nutshell. And after this, we'll talk about something else. We'll talk to you later. Bye.